I'm back with Frank Gaffney, founder, executive chairman of the Center for Security Policy, website centerforsecuritypolicy.org. Frank, when you and I were in the Reagan years, there was a kind of clear framework, the Cold War framework, which divided the world by and large into the free world and broadly the Soviet orbit. And since then, there hasn't been an equally kind of easy way to think about the threats that America faces. At one point, it seemed around 9/11, it was, a resurgent radical Islam, for example. Now, how do you think about the world today? Do you think that there is a kind of axis of evil developing with perhaps China and Iran or the radical Muslims, and then maybe Russia? Are we looking at those powers kind of allying with each other and creating a formidable new threat to the United States? Or do you think that our biggest threats are not in any of those places, but actually come from within the United States?
Oh, great question. Let me back the lens up just for a minute, because you've introduced the Cold War, which was a formative experience for both of us. In 1991, the then General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party, Deng Xiaoping, observed what was happening in the Soviet Union, thanks to our old boss, Ronald Reagan's deliberate efforts and strategy for destroying what he called the evil empire. Deng said, the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union is over. The Soviet Union has lost. A new Cold War is beginning between the United States and China will win. And he set in train what came to be called the hide and bide strategy. And by that he meant, we will profess, for the consumption of the United States, most especially in the West more generally, to be interested in just being another partner in the international community. And we will use what resources we can get them to give us, technology and financing and, other forms of support and legitimacy, to prepare for the day when we will destroy the West and we will rule the world. And that has contributed, I think, materially to the lack of clarity about the kind of crisis that we now face. Yes, from within, but also from the quarters that you've mentioned, most especially the Chinese Communist Party. Never in this nation's history, never, I would argue, in the history of the world, has there been a more dangerous power than that of the Chinese Communist Party. And in part, that's because of that lack of clarity and because of all of the help that we've given them. And by the way, that we are continuing to give them. By some estimates, Dinesh, $3 to $6 trillion has been transferred by Wall Street, what China calls their old friends there, from American investors, mostly unwittingly. Pension funds, 401k plans, mutual funds, index funds, exchange-traded funds, to the Chinese Communist Party's various companies. That has enabled, I believe, this threat to be made as formidable as it is and to become more so, including the threat now of kinetic warfare against us and our friends. And they're doing it in concert, as you say, with Russia, with Iran, with North Korea, and now, unfortunately, thanks to something else that we financed, their so-called Belt and Road Initiative, a whole host of other countries that they've essentially colonized and are now building infrastructure from which to project power. So just to conclude, that is the mortal threat, what our boss Ronald Reagan would call the existential threat to freedom of our time. I believe it's the worst in history, and we must be aware of it, clear-eyed about it, and addressing it as such. And we have to understand that, yes, there is an enemies within this country piece of it that we have to attend to as well, that is enabling this threat from outside and is arguably making our situation vastly more perilous than, again, ever in our history.
When you alluded to Deng Xiaoping and the hide and bide strategy, I'm assuming you're referring to the famous statement by Deng where he goes, hide our strength, bide our time.
Yes.
And it seems that the Chinese, in that sense, have been far more stealthy about this than the Soviet Union ever was. Let me close
Until
by...
recently, they're becoming, the mask has sort of slipped under Xi Jinping.
Yes. Let me ask you whether you think, I mean, there are people who say that the Biden family has made a lot of money in China, not just Hunter Biden, but Frank Biden, James Biden, Joe Biden himself. Do you think that Biden's very soft policy on China can be, at least in part, explained by the fact that that he's can be explained by the fact of 10% for the big guy?
Yeah, I can. A colleague of ours by the name of Sam Faddis, a career undercover Central Intelligence Agency operative who used to recruit and run assets for our country in some pretty awful places around the world for a living, describes Joe Biden using his own experience and the terms and tradecraft of espionage as a controlled asset of the Chinese Communist Party. And do I think that has something to do with the fact that we're not only seeing him pursue policies that China clearly likes, but he's pursuing policies that are destroying our country to the advantage of the Chinese Communist Party? I think that's pretty much the consistent, characterization of these policies, whether it's domestic, the border, our economy, our military, you name it. Bad for America, good for the CCP.
Very chilling. Frank, I'm going to have you back to talk more about all this. Thank you very much for joining me. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you.